the reason why I decided to interview Matt is because I really never watched any kind of language YouTubers, but when I was checking out Matt's content, I felt it was so deep and his proficiency level was so deep. It's crazy. So kind of played the video of Matt speaking Japanese, and my teacher didn't know he was a foreigner, and then I said, "Oh, he's a foreigner." She was kind of shocked. That's actually how good his level is. It's just I think it's really the highest level the person can reach in terms of learning any language. This is why today I just decided to interview absolute legend in language learning, in my opinion, Matt versus Japan. And yeah, so Matt, can you just share with us your story, how you started, and what's your secret?
Yeah, so well, first of all, thanks for having me on. But yeah, my name's Matt. Let's see. I first became interested in learning Japanese in high school, and for the first couple years, I did what most people do, like just I took classes at my high school and I watched anime with English subtitles and didn't make a lot of progress. And then starting 2 years on, I started a really hardcore, almost full-time immersion approach where I was trying to listen and read Japanese as close to every waking hour as possible. And I combined that with making lots of Anki cards and basically just doing a very heavy input approach. And yeah, I did that for basically 5 years nonstop. For 6 months of that, I was in Japan towards the beginning, but for the vast majority, I was in America learning Japanese, and the vast majority of the gains that I made, I was in America. So yeah, I had this 5 year period where I was during learning Japanese super hardcore. At the end of those 5 years, I was really, really good at Japanese. After that, I kind of started my YouTube channel where I talked about learning Japanese and other languages, mainly through input. That's kind of the main core of what I talk about. And yeah, 2 years ago, I finally moved to Japan. So I had basically learned Japanese outside of Japan in America to like this crazy high level of fluency, and then still just kept living in America for some reason for many, many years. And then finally, after many years of running my YouTube channel, I finally moved to Japan. So now I've been living in Japan for almost 2.5 years, finally.
Awesome. So, if people, in case people want to discover your kind of approach, or just where, like, is there any platform that you want them to visit in order to discover your approach?
Yeah, I mean, most of my content's on YouTube, but yeah, recently I also started a school community, like SKOOL, which is basically just like an online community where you can come and join for $20 right now. And then I have a lot more exclusive content and other newer content that I've been working on these last, year or so. And I also do kind of like monthly group calls where all the members and I get on a call and we talk to each other and got to talk about what's going well, what's not going well, try to help all you guys out, and I'll also do some other fun stuff in there. So yeah, I guess if you resonate with my approach and what I say, then definitely come check it out.
Yeah, community is the most important thing because if you think about it, the biggest motivator is to see the person just like you achieving the levels that you want. And there's a saying which goes like, you're the average of five people you hang out with the most, or the
Mm.
average of five influencers that
Mm.
influences that influence you the most. So yeah, so basically, I think community is the best thing, really. So um, I have a couple of questions that I prepared, and those questions kind of come from the videos that I've watched where you talked about your approach. Some of the videos are from a very long time ago, so you probably don't even remember what you said in those videos. But I still try to ask you those questions that you. So basically, one of the things that just kind of shocked me a little bit was that you said. So the first thing that you mentioned, your story is extremely different from a lot of people because you say a lot of language learners who have native level in a language, but they've lived in the country for 5 years, for 10 years, for the whole life. And some of them, if not most of them, still have a foreign accent. And people talk about fluency and like becoming fluent, and this guy's fluent, I'm fluent. And but they don't really, a lot of people don't really comprehend how much effort it takes to get so native so that people can't really distinguish you from a person of that country. And this kind of fluency is almost non-expressible. It's like it's really hard to express it in words. What kind of like native fluency or this kind of term. But so I was kind of shocked with your story that you reached that level before you went to Japan. That's the first thing that shocked me. And the second thing was that you said that you didn't do any kind of output for 3 years, and you were just doing purely input. And then when you start doing output, you start doing it with precision, training your pitch accent, and finding a so-called language parent and mimicking them. So it was a very, very interesting story. And I'm kind of curious about this kind of 3 year period where you didn't do any output. And do you still recommend everybody who's learning Japanese or any other foreign language do the same approach? And did you kind of reconsider that, or do you still think it's really useful to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's kind of in a way a broad topic, but yeah, to talk about my personal experience, I mean, I did have a period, like I said, early on where I was in Japan for 6 months, and it was really close to the beginning. So I kind of had to try to speak during that 6 month period, but I also barely could because I had just started speaking Japanese and I was still really terrible. And then I
Mm,
came back from Japan and then I didn't speak at all, yeah, for like another year. And then I had an opportunity to like spontaneously, like there was this opportunity I had where I bumped into some Japanese people basically and got to speak to them. And I found that even though I hadn't spoken in a year, my speaking had gotten way better just because that whole year I was doing tons and tons of input, just listening and reading Japanese constantly. And so that kind of how helped me realize I was on the right path. And then after that, I did a whole another year of just pure input, no output. And then by the time I had reached the 3 year mark of my kind of hardcore Japanese learning journey, then I found, yeah, I could speak pretty well. I mean, not perfectly, but basically, my experience was that through input, you're just basically stocking up in your head this bigger and bigger database of the way that natives speak, right? And you're also kind of building up your intuition
mm,
because when you're, for example, listening to a native speech in a foreign language, right? It's so fast, you don't have time to consciously process what's happening, right? If you're trying to sit there and like think about what grammar is being used and what conjugation, what form of words conjugated into, and all these other things, like no one's brain is fast enough to do that. So if you're able to train yourself to listen and just instantly understand effortlessly without having to translate in your head, what that basically means is you have built up an unconscious model of that language in your head that you can use instantly, right? And intuitively. And so just like how you're kind of built up this intuition that allows you to listen to the language and understand it, you can kind of use that same infrastructure in your head to go in the reverse direction, start with meaning, and then know how to intuitively kind of put that into the target language. And so, yeah, my experience was, if I wouldn't think like, how do I say X English phrase in Japanese? I would
mm,
instead kind of the way I kind of like query my brain is I'd say like, what would a Japanese person say in this situation? And then my brain would just pop up. It would, all these different possibilities would kind of pop up. And I would have an intuition whether something was correct or not. There were some things I was just I knew like, oh, I know this is correct because I've heard people say things like this many times. And there'd be other things where I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is wrong. And there's other things where I'm like, maybe this is right, I'm not sure. Right. So that's kind of how it felt at the beginning. So I try to stick with only saying the things where I was like, yeah, I know this is correct.
mm,
And then sometimes I had to fall back on the things where were kind of in that gray area. But then I'd try to go back and check later or just keep it in my mind so that next time it just came up spontaneously when I was listening to Japanese, I could kind of confirm like, oh, it was correct, or oh no, they say it a little bit differently or something like that. And yeah, so that's how I ended up speaking, and it allowed me to basically avoid making any bad habits because
mm,
bad habits are this really tricky thing that I think a lot of people overlook. And basically, with anything in life, it's a lot easier to learn to do something right the first time than to unlearn how to do it the wrong way. Once you've created a habit, it's like that pathway is in your brain. You can let that pathway atrophy, but it's almost never going to return to the state of that connection having never been made in the first place, right? So bad habits are really tricky things that ultimately you want to avoid. It's just a lot easier to just only make good habits the first time than to make all these bad habits and have to go and fix them later. And so if you're trying to speak the language a lot before you have this kind of intuition that I'm talking about building through getting tons and
mm,
tons of input, then naturally you're going to make tons of mistakes. And a lot of those mistakes are going to repeat and a lot of them are going to become habits. So for me, this approach of avoiding output as much as possible until I had this intuition allowed me to avoid making any bad habits because by the time I started to speak, I already could mostly tell whether something was correct or not, like I said.
mm,
So that allowed me to very quickly get to the point where I was could speak very fluently and had very high accuracy. And so
mm,
yeah, overall, I think this is a really good approach. It's hard to implement practically speaking for a lot of people, right? Because you're kind of like delaying the gratification of being able to speak for such a long period of time. And so I don't think you have to go as hardcore as me, depending on your goals. Like if you want to guarantee as much as possible that you're going to sound 100% native in the language, then yeah, you should do what I did. But if you're more
Mm,
moderate, like the vast majority of people are, where you want to get very fluent, but you don't care about being 100% perfect, then and you have like a little more margin for error, then you don't have to wait quite as long. I'd say you could wait like a year or you know, maybe even less potentially. But if the earlier you're starting, the more it's important to try to have some kind of infrastructure where you're getting feedback from native speakers to correct you so that
mm,
you can try to avoid making bad habits that way. Because the earlier you start, the more mistakes you're going to make when you speak. And so, yeah, it's not a good idea to assume that a native speaker will ever point out all of your mistakes to you. But you can get people to point out the most glaring mistakes or the ones that you repeat many times and things like that, and you can try to
mm.
avoid bad habits that way. So it's not a perfect solution. It's much more the relying on native feedback, I think, is a lot more faulty than just building your own intuition and relying on that. But it's a lot better than nothing, basically.
Yeah, that's a really, really profound response. One thing I was kind of curious about because this 3 year period, when you're talking about massive input, I've done massive input when learning English. I was just exposing myself to like you did, like 5 hours a day of YouTube videos on the topics I was interested in. But the hardest part of language learning, in my opinion, is the very, very beginning. So
Hmm.
before you start, because many people ask me, Victor, how much should I expose myself to the language? And I have this answer. And also, how much should I speak the language? I have this answer. It depends on your level. So if you're a beginner, it's like a scale. So if you're a complete beginner, maybe you should speak for like 1 minute and you should expose yourself for 1 minute. If you're upper beginner, it like basically 5 minutes. If you're intermediate, maybe it's like longer time, like 30, 60 minutes. If you're advanced, it should be maybe the majority of your time with the language should be like exposing yourself or practicing. So, um, and I'm kind of curious about your journey when you just started out, like the very first thing that you did, because I just today actually refinished Genki 2 and so many people they study with Genki textbooks. Actually, the next textbook I'm studying now was Quartet textbooks, and I've been kind of on YouTube. I think I'm the only person who talks about textbooks and just like how textbooks are important and stuff like this, and that you need to finish like 4 textbooks to get to start speaking and stuff like this. So I was kind of curious about your opinion on textbooks and just the very beginning of your journey. Maybe you did consciously, unconsciously. Maybe you're in kind of system or kind of class with the teacher and it influenced you and probably you didn't think have to think about it too much. But I'm just kind of curious about your very beginning of your journey right before you started exposing yourself, because so in order to start exposing yourself you have to have some knowledge, because otherwise it will be just complete gibberish that you hear. Is like you can understand the exposure doesn't work that much. So yeah, can you share with us like about the very kind of beginning of your journey of learning Japanese?
Yeah, I mean, like pretty much the very first thing that I did when I decided I wanted to learn Japanese was, go to the Jap. I was in the middle of a semester at high school, so I went to the Japanese teacher and I was like, "Hey, can I switch into Japanese class?" And at first he was like, "Well, Japanese is really hard. Most people struggle even if they start from the beginning. So I'm worried that if you transferred halfway through that, you wouldn't be able to keep up. Like, you wouldn't be able to catch up to everyone."
Mm,
And I basically was like, no, I'm super passionate. I'll do whatever it takes. Just please let me. And so he's like, okay, fine. So basically, I just got the textbook that they were using. It wasn't Genki. It
mm,
was some pretty niche textbook. I don't even remember what it was called.
mm,
It was just some random textbook that was probably similar to Genki in a lot of ways. I don't think it was particularly good, but yeah, I just bought the textbook and I just read it and retained the information in it basically. And then transferred into the class, and I didn't find it very challenging because most
mm,
people who were there, they were only taking it because they were required to take a language, and they weren't actually very motivated or interested in learning Japanese. So no one really studied, and therefore we had to go really, really slow in the class. And so during summer break, because I don't know about the rest of the world, in America we get a 3 month summer break. I went to basically like summer school. Like I went to the local community college and took the equivalent of the second year. And I remember there we used a different textbook. It was called Yokoso, which again is just another textbook that's probably similar to Genki and
mm,
probably not particularly very good. But yeah, I did it's just a typical Japanese class where basically you have a teacher and there's other students and you walk through the textbook. So I did that, and then when I went back the next year of high school, I started in like Japanese year 3. And then we went back to the original textbook that I was using. And it was, yeah, some point along there. Or I guess, yeah, I did that for another year. And then that summer, I went to Japan for 3 weeks on this trip kind of through my school. And it was super awesome and it made me like super motivated. And so it was right when I came back from that trip that I decided I wanted to like start going really hardcore and like take Japanese learning into my own hands. And so at that time, after that, I used this grammar guide online called like Take Him's Grammar Guide, which is just this free guide you can find online. Again, it's not particularly good, but it has some advantages over things like Genki, where things like Genki, they're designed so that, if you potentially only do the first couple chapters of Genki and then you actually go and hit the streets of Japan and start using what you learned, you'll be okay, right? Like that's why they teach you the polite forms first before the casual forms. Because like if they taught you the casual forms first and you only did the first chapter and you just went and started speaking casual Japanese to the people on the street, in reality it wouldn't matter because Japanese people would just know, oh, you're a foreigner and you suck at Japanese, so you can't help but be impolite. And in reality, they wouldn't care at all. But as people say, like, oh, that's not ideal. Like ideally, you would speak politely because Japanese people speak politely when they meet strangers in the street or whatever. And so, yeah, textbooks like Genki teach the polite forms first. But if you actually look at the language structurally, kind of on a first principles basis, the polite forms are kind of like a modification of the casual forms. The casual forms are the root base forms. And so if you want to learn the language systematically, it makes much more logical sense to start with the casual forms and
Mhm.
and actually like study the language in the way that the language is actually structured. And so Take Kim's grammar guide taught it that way. It was kind of taught it on a very like first principles basis. All the way that the Japanese was translated into English was trying to accurately represent the Japanese. So the English was actually unnatural because it was trying to, as close as possible, say like represent exactly what the Japanese was saying. It wasn't worrying about translating into natural English. So there are some, I think, problems with that guide. For example, like it teaches really rare things that you almost never see, and then doesn't teach some other common stuff, which is kind of weird. And there's some arguments he makes about his interpretation of the grammar of Japanese that are debatable, but overall, I like, went through that guide and I think it kind of helped fill in any holes that I missed through the textbooks that I did. And, it was a nice review. I made Anki cards for all the example sentences. And after that, I basically never used a textbook ever again. I just went full immersion and just learned things as I came across them, like in real Japanese.
Oh, so basically, in your story, I can hear that you just how many textbooks have you finished in total? Like, can you calculate how many of them? Because you went through like three full courses, you said? Like it was like 3 months for every how long was it in total, like with your college courses and how many textbooks? Can
I
you
mean,
quantify?
well, see, probably like one and a half, maybe. Like because the term didn't go through the 1 year of Japanese didn't
Mm.
cover the whole textbook, I think. I think it only covered like part of it. Like
Oh,
because it was a high school class, they went at like a slower pace than like a college class,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I did like three. So if you say that like one term is like half a textbook, I did like three full terms, maybe in
Mm.
between two, one and a half and two, maybe.
Mm. Yeah.
And then take Kim's Grammar Guide. It's like it kind of like started at zero and was like its own textbook, you could say.
Um,
But the thing about Take Kim's Grammar Guide is like most textbook, they don't just teach you grammar, right? They try to teach you everything. They teach you vocab, they teach you
yeah.
like situations, what language you use in certain situations. And so it's kind of comprehensive, right?
Mm.
It's not it's meant to be a whole course on the Japanese language, not just Japanese grammar. Whereas
Mm.
Taken's grammar guide was just the grammar. It really
Mm.
just explained the grammar structurally, but it explained the entire grammar. But it's actually
Mm.
really short. Like Taken's grammar guide is way shorter than the textbook. Like I think I
Mm.
finished the whole thing in like 1 month, or maybe
Mm.
even less. But that alone taught me the whole grammar. So in a way, that feels more valuable than the textbook because like
Mm.
textbooks, they'll have a chapter when it's like, okay, now today we're learning animals. Here's
Mm.
how to say cow, and here's how to say dog. And then they'll
Mm.
have like a chapter on colors or a chapter on like days of the week and like all these things. But like
Mm.
you don't need a textbook that's basically just random lists of nouns. Like you don't need a textbook to teach you lists of nouns. You can just learn nouns as they come up when you're watching content, right? You can just
Mhm.
be watching YouTube video with like target language subtitles, and when it comes up, if there's a noun you don't know, you can just look it up and learn it, right? You don't need a
Mhm.
textbook to like teach you the meaning of these basic nouns. So I think there's kind of a lot of bloat, you could say, in those textbooks that like
Mhm.
are not really crucial for getting started with real immersion in the language. Like the basic grammar, if you don't have that, it does make it really hard to
Mhm.
get started in the language. So what I would say is rather than going through a textbook, I would use a frequency list. Like learn the most common 1,000 words in the language because
Mhm.
that the due to the way frequency works, like those most common 1,000 words will cover like 80% or more of the words that show up in daily conversation. And then go through like a grammar guide that just explains to you structurally what the grammar is. And that alone, I think, prepares you enough to jump into immersion.
That's really a lot of the things that you mentioned. That's really interesting. So, kind of the opposite of what I say. Basically, I don't like the list of words because they have like no context. And I just find myself like very bored when I start with like when I just look at the list of words. And first of all, like it's very hard for me to memorize because I always say you memorize the situation or the sentence, you don't memorize the word, you kind of memorize the context. So if the word is kind of out of the context, even one example sentence for me is kind of not enough. So I was like, well, it's better to memorize the like 10 words instead of one word, just 10 words in a text with new words with like five new grammar patterns rather than just do this those things separately. But it's very interesting to hear a perspective because um, you kind of did it separately a little bit after you didn't like textbooks as much, but you like this kind of focusing on grammar, then focusing on vocabulary separately type of thing. I think it's kind of interesting perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Anyways.
that yeah, like well, a couple of things. Like the in the my model, like it kind of sounds like your model, which is the model that most people who talk about learning languages have, is that you're trying to start speaking very early on, or at least
Mm,
compared to my model, extremely early,
mm,
like extremely early. And so the way that you're doing that in a way, right, is you're using the information from the textbook to help you kind of translate from your native language into the target language, right? Like a lot of what the textbook teaches are almost like formulas, transformation formulas that help you go from like, in my
mm,
case, right, English into Japanese or
mm,
something, right? And that can work, but it has like flaws, right? So if your goal is to get, to a functional level as quickly as possible in speaking, then I think that's the best strategy. But if your final goal is to sound like a native speaker, then that
mm,
strategy is not very helpful because the way that language works is that it's what I call highly specific and unpredictable ways. So, like for example, in Japanese, like in English, right, we say like I need to go to the bathroom. But in
mm,
Japanese, if you said the literal equivalent of I need to go to the bathroom, it would sound really odd. The way
mm,
that they say it is more close to like I want to go to the bathroom. And that's just the way they say it. But if you didn't know that ahead of time, if you didn't know like the exact words that Japanese people use to say that they want to go to the bathroom or they need to go to the bathroom, then you wouldn't be able to just predict it from like thinking in nouns and like thinking in like grammar principles. And so because of that, if you take the strategy of thinking in your native language and trying to translate into the target language, they'll understand you a lot of the time, but you'll end up saying things that a native speaker wouldn't say. That's kind of natural. And some people try to combat this by being like, oh, well, I teach through context or I teach through situations. And that can help through an extent, but like there's just so many situations that like, you won't be able to cover that all by like consciously learning them like one by one. So I guess my method is more geared towards when I say learn a word, the purpose of learning the word is so that when it comes up when you're listening, you can you can have an easier time trying to understand it through context. But yeah, if you just learn a word on a list out of context, you're not going to use that word yourself for sure because you need to know the context and stuff to use it. But the way that I kind of think about it is like to truly understand what a word means in all of its exact nuance, you have to see that word getting used in like countless context anyway, like 10 plus different contexts for your
mm,
brain to really kind of get a grasp of the nuance on it. So either way, whether you use like a textbook scenario or you just learn out of context, like either way, it's not going to be enough for you to master the word. So I assume that in order to master the word, you're going to need to come across it in native context multiple times. And so when I say like learn the most common 1,000 words, I more just mean like make a bookmark entry for that word in your head and write like a little simple note to self of roughly what the word means, because that will help you kind of infer what it means. Like that, like when you see it in context, that little hint will help you kind of grasp more what it means combined with context. And then over time, through seeing in different contexts, that's when your understanding will actually kind of like crystallize into something with like a high level of accuracy and nuance, I guess.
Yeah, so I completely agree with this point. So the point that I have with textbooks is that when actually when talking, especially talking about like really good textbooks, for example, this Quartet textbook is pretty good, I think. I'm not sure about Genki because, but I heard that Quartet is good teacher, like Japanese teacher said. But with for Chinese, I like Beijing University press textbooks, and they have a lot of textbooks. They literally represent the real life dialogues of people. They're very natural and they show you the word, but they also show you the usages of this. Even like in Chinese, there is like even a special word for usages of the word, and they already kind of show you the usages of this word. That's why I like textbook approach because yeah, you learn the word and they show you the usages. Maybe
Mm.
those usages are not enough, but they're like kind of enough to start. So I think we're still talking about kind of the same thing, but different
Yeah.
strategies for achieving kind of the same thing. Where we're all talking about, oh, learning a word is not learning a word. Learning a word is kind of you're learning the usages. Even if you learn the word, even couple usages is not is it's not enough, and like just translation is not enough, obviously. So yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's
actually, yeah. So like clarify, I think that like if there was a textbook that taught the grammar systematically alongside the most common thousand words and kind of taught them in unison through sentences or through
mm,
texts, then I think that would be really good. That'd be pretty ideal. I think the problem, like I said, is that, like for example, Genki, it doesn't meet
mm,
either of those two criteria. First of all, it doesn't teach the grammar systematically, and it doesn't teach based off frequency. Like you're going to be learning very rare words before common words, and there's some very common words you might not learn for like the entire first book or something, right? So I think the fundamentally the format of a textbook is not problematic. It could be ideal, right? Like I said, like if you're
mm,
taking my strategy where you kind of just have a grammar guide and then you have like
mm,
a list of words, like
mm,
you'll that will probably not get you as far as if you had a text that actually combined them in unison and was able to teach the grammar and the vocab alongside each other through context based. I think
mm.
that would be more ideal. So I mean, I'm not familiar with that textbook you just mentioned, the quartz that you said. I want
Ah,
to say.
yeah, Quartet text. That this one. This one's
Yeah. So so
it's
maybe that meets
yeah.
that criteria. I'm not sure. All I know is that Genki and the other textbook I used in high school, like definitely did not meet those two criteria.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. So the thing that I noticed with the language textbooks, with my experience, so I've worked with, I've myself learned Korean through textbooks, and I mean, I've been promoting textbooks a lot, but Korean textbooks are really like the most horrible textbooks I've ever seen in any language. And the reasons why they actually do teach the highest formal, like there are different types of formality, but the interesting thing is that they teach the formality that is not even used in kind of real life interactions, used in companies and like corporate
Mm,
settings. It's like there is a grammar, it's like мнida мнida grammar. And it's like, and this grammar is extremely formal. It is used with like with people you don't know sometimes, but people would use like yo ending, and they start with the teaching this grammar, in my opinion, because it's easier to teach, not because it's a logical
mm,
evolution of the language or like the grammar, like you said, like in Japanese, but and they also teach a lot of expressions. They show two students talking, and those two students use the grammar which is actually used in corporate world, and it's kind of weird. It's just the situation
mm,
really does not look natural, and the two students would speak in formal language to each other, but they show them speaking with this formal endings, and it's really kind of cringy, and it's like
mm,
looks really weird. And but what I noticed, even with those textbooks that show very natural dialogues at the beginning, the more you progress, the more natural the dialogues
mm,
become, and the better you kind of start grasping the formality levels. But it does take this kind of couple months of just not being able to understand what's going on. But yeah, there are. I would just say one thing is there are better textbooks, and there are textbooks which are not as good. Some textbooks really it's impossible to self-study with. Some textbooks are really they do really require a teacher. But the general approach that I completely 100% agree with you with is that even if you finish a textbook, even or you finish the vocabulary list, you still have to have, I think like not even tens, but like hundreds and thousands of exposure times when you hear this word in so many different contexts so that it just goes under your skin. And whenever somebody like when talking to you, whenever somebody says it, you know how to use it, and you yourself just automatically, subconsciously, without even realizing that you can dream, like when while dreaming, you can use this word in a sentence, like dreaming in Japanese and say this word. So yeah, I 100% agree on that point of usages. I think usages really,
Mm.
it's exposure of usages is probably like the king of language learning, probably in mastering the language.
Yeah,
Agree.
and one other thing that I'll say is that like I do think someone should use like a primer. If we're going to use the word like primer, right? That it's something that you do that involves conscious study before you just go into immersing yourself full time and learning through immersion. So that could be a textbook, it could be a guide you read online, it could be like it could involve just a list of words. So there's many different types of primers. And I definitely do recommend that people use a primer and like if you were able to find a good textbook, then that could be a really good primer. But I
Mm,
think a trap that a lot of people fall into is staying in that primer phase way too long.
yeah.
Like learning the primer, it's kind of similar to like learning the rules of a game, right? Like if you wanted to like get really good at poker or something, right? Before you can actually just start playing the game, you have to learn what the rules are, right?
Mm,
But when you start learning the rules, you still don't have any skill. Your process of like building your skill at getting good at poker is only going to start when you actually start playing games, right? And like practicing playing games. So it's kind of similar. Like the people will think like they'll be going through textbooks and then they have plenty of foundational knowledge, right? Like they've already done enough priming for immersion, but when they actually go and try to listen to native speech, they won't understand very much, and so they'll conclude like, oh, I need to go do more priming, right? When in
mm,
reality, the no matter how much you prime yourself, when you very first start listening to native content, you're not going to understand that much. That's just kind of how it goes. And you
mm.
you get better understanding it through that exposure, right? The more you listen, the more you understand. And so at a certain point, you need to just jump in and start learning like from the real thing itself. And a lot of people, I think, overestimate how much textbook work they need before they can actually just jump into that.
Mm. Can you share? So basically, because I want to summarize your approach, like your journey, so that people, because I've seen a lot of interviews that where you talk about your journey with learning a language, and then you would mention, oh, I did this and did that, but it was kind of separate. So I want to, in
Yeah.
this one intro, I want to kind of create this timeline of your approach, like how you actually did that. So the first phase, as far as I can see, so it's like 1.5 or two textbooks that you finished. Then you use some additional guide, and then you started or at the same time after that you kind of started exposing yourself, or how you call it, input, started doing input. So the question that I have while doing the input, because I myself, practically speaking, I mean, I've been doing input in Chinese, Korean, English, and also Japanese. But the problem that I face all the time is that whenever I do this input thing, if I'm not strong in a language, for example, Japanese, I'm not strong in Japanese, I have to just stop the video or whatever it is I'm listening to, and I have to like translate the word and create an Enki card with that, or should I just guess half of the words and translate half of the words? Like, what is your approach to that? How did you do that so that you can master thousands of words over the period of years, while exposing yourself and also watching something that you like? I heard that you watched animes. Or also like you said that you read in Japanese also. So what is the actual practical approach that you did during that period of time?
Yeah, so basically, my approach at the beginning, when I started doing full-time input, even though I had done all that, the textbooks and the guide and everything, like I probably only understood like maybe 5% of what I was watching. I was just
Mm,
watching anime from the beginning. Now, I wasn't watching something that was like made for a learner or made for a child. It was just anime that was made for, I don't know, someone at least middle school age, maybe older. Now, within that, I did try to choose shows that were more accessible. So, like, basically, the way I thought about it is you have to balance your own interest with the difficulty of the content. So, first, I would say, okay, what's all the content I'm genuinely interested in? And anything that didn't fit into that category, I ignored, right? So, shows made for 3-year-olds, maybe they're more comprehensible, but I was not interested in them, so I didn't consider those. Then, out of all the stuff that I was genuinely interested in, I tried to ask what was the easiest to understand, and I started with that. So I was still considering level. I wasn't just going for whatever and not even thinking about whether it was going to be difficult or not. But even then, because I was still constraining it by what I was interested in, I was probably only understanding like 5% of the anime that I was watching at the beginning. And so I wasn't trying to understand every sentence. I was allowing most of the Japanese to kind of just wash over me and not understand. And I would only really stop and look something up if I felt like I almost could understand that sentence, right? Or especially the main thing I did at the very beginning was I just let it wash over me. And there's certain words that just start to pop out at you because they're super frequently used and you don't know them. And so I would kind of wait for a word to be like, okay, I feel like I've seen this a bunch of times. And I would naturally have like a curiosity for that particular word. And then I would look it up and maybe make an Anki card. But that would only happen every, I don't know, couple minutes, which isn't too overwhelming, right? Like maybe it'll happen once or twice every like 10 minutes, right? And so in that way, I was, I slowly went from like 5% understanding to 6% to kind of 7% and just kind of grew it that way. And at each different stage, I had kind of different criteria of like, how do I choose when to look something up, right? Because if you're looking up too many things and you're stopping it too frequently,
Mm.
then it just doesn't come in, right? You start kind of feeling like you're forgetting what you're looking up the moment after you do look it up, and you don't get into a flow state, right? And so a different basically my standard for when I would look up a word was kind of constantly evolving depending on my level, right? Like
Mm.
eventually, once I was doing this for a couple years, I knew like 99% of the words. And so after a certain point, I looked up every single word I didn't know because I would only come across a word I didn't know like once an hour to begin with, right?
Mm.
But at the beginning, you can't do that. So you have to kind of come up with some kind of heuristic or metric for you to know when it's worth looking up a word so you don't get overwhelmed.
So basically you don't mean when exposing yourself, you don't mean to look up every single word that you don't
Mm.
understand, but at the very beginning you kind of felt which words were kind of a keywords in the context or frequently used words. So it's like like if some show or some anime that you're watching and the words this word keeps repeating over and over and over again, it seems to be a keyword that
Yeah.
kind of tells you what the context of the situation is all about. So you would you would look up these kind of words, right?
Yeah, like you could say another way is maybe you want to look up one word every 2 minutes roughly. And
Mm.
so then you just kind of think like, okay, out of all the words I'm going to come across in this 2 minute period, is this going to be the most valuable, like high yield one? And you kind of just you don't think
Ah.
about it that logically, but it's kind of just a feeling that you develop as you do this process, right? You kind of feel like, okay, this is you have roughly a rough sense of how often you want to look something up. And then you have a
Mm.
rough sense of like, is this valuable enough to be one of the words I look up or not, and so it's I think
Mm.
when you start doing this process, it's something you come to very intuitively because you want to basically look up as much as possible without getting kicked out of a flow state. And so you
Yeah.
kind of just learn through trial and error, like how much can you look up, what's worth looking up and what's not, based on what keeps you in the flow.
So so one question that I have here is because you said at the beginning that you could understand only 10% of what you were watching, and I tried it myself. And I caught myself, I think back in the day, I tried like watching something in Japanese or Chinese when I couldn't speak Chinese or couldn't understand just a little bit. And I couldn't make myself consistent with it because, these days, especially, maybe not when you started, but now people have so many distractions. For
Mm,
example, now if I open YouTube, I would see like Joe Rogan has this podcast with Elon Musk, so I have to I have to watch it, right? And this is where my exposure kind of stops. Like I was watching something in Japanese, I couldn't understand it, but something which is more flashy tries to kind of get my attention. And these days, especially with like short form content, with TikTok, YouTube Shorts, and all kind of interesting things flashing in front of you, the true thing, because your approach actually made you a complete 100% outlier in this field. And what would you recommend to a person to just get rid of those distractions? Because it's very hard to stay consistent. It should be so interesting for you so that you can watch it for hours, even while understanding just a few sentences from it, like 10% of it or even less. So should it be like so much interesting so that it just gets like all your interest and makes you watch it for so many hours every single day? That's the first question. And the second question is, how do you avoid the kind of avoid other types of content that don't
yeah.
necessarily benefit your language learning?
So yeah, it's a really important point. And the way that I think about it is that there's two different types of consuming content, you could say, or like enjoy, or two different types of like kind of, entertainment that we get from different types of content, right? One is a purely passive form. So when you're watching a movie or a YouTube video in your native language, you're just listening to it. Or if it's a book, you're just reading it. You're not creating anything while you're doing it. You're not, there's no output from you. It's a purely input based activity, right? It's purely passive. Whereas if you're doing something like playing a video game, you're actually constantly, you are outputting, right? You're putting inputs into the game, and it's a back and forth between you and the game, right? And those are different types of entertainment that we get, like in your brain. So on the surface, when I'm talking about, okay, I'm understanding 5% of this, I'm looking up words, I'm making Anki cards, it seems like it's the first type of activity, right? Like, oh, I'm just watching a show. It's a passive activity. But in reality, it's closer to that second like type where it's more like you're playing a video game or something. Because you're actively engaging with it, right? You're looking it up, and it's a game of like how much can I understand, right? Like can I, first of all, like
Mm.
can I how many words can I pick out? Like if you're listening without subtitles, right? It's like how many words can I pick out? Because actually you're not going to be able to even pick out all the words that you know, right? If you actually try to do this, right? You could learn 500 words, and those words could be popping up all the time, but it'll be so fast and it'll be so blended into the words coming before and after it that you won't even notice that you heard a word that you actually know. And so if you're listening, you can play the game of like, okay, how many words can I pick out, right? It's almost kind of like a whack-a-mole game or something, right? You're trying to be vigilant and like pick out all the different words. And if it's with subtitles, right, you can just, it's just a game of how many sentences can I understand, right? How can I infer to understand even when I don't know a word based on the context, right? That's something you can be like thinking about. And so it feels more like you're playing a game. And people can play games, even really challenging games like, Dark Souls or whatever, right? For like hours and hours and hours on end. So for me, I think the reason why I was able to spend so many hours doing it is because it felt like I was addicted to a video game, right? I was getting lots
Mm.
of dopamine from it. I wasn't like sitting there in this austere, like, like stoic meditative monk being like, yeah, this is really boring, but I'm forcing myself to do it, right? Like, even
Uh,
though it wasn't that I was enjoying the story, I was understanding the game of like, can I push my understanding forward more? Can I glean a little bit more understanding out of my current Japanese? And the other thing is when you're spending a lot of time doing this, you get better really quickly, especially at the beginning, right? There's like these like there's kind of newbie gains that you can make, just like with like
mm.
working out. And so when you're making these newbie gains and you literally feel like you're better today than you were yesterday, like that encourages you to do it because then like, well, imagine how good I'm going to be tomorrow. Imagine how good I'm going to be next week, right? You kind of have this dopamine-based thrill of constantly growing and constantly improving, which also kind of fuels you. And so that's one part of it is it's kind of switching your mindset to thinking it more as a video game rather than just like passively consuming content. And the other aspect you said of not being distracted is, yeah, I think it's really beneficial to try to control your environment. Like for me, I have a bunch of different YouTube accounts, and one of them, I only watch Japanese YouTube videos. And so when I open up the YouTube app on my phone and I'm logged into this account, all the recommended videos are only in Japanese. And I have a separate account I use for English. Now, in general, I try to only watch YouTube videos on my computer. And on my computer, I have a browser extension that hides all recommended videos. So, and it hides the homepage. So basically, the only way I can watch an English YouTube video is either if I search for it actively and click the button, or go to someone's channel and click the video, or someone sends me a link, right? I don't get caught in this rabbit hole of just recommended video to recommended video to recommended video. And every once in a while on my phone, I'll log into the English version of YouTube, and then all these recommended videos that look amazing, right? Like you said, like, okay, oh, Joe Rogan with Elon Musk, whatever. Yeah, I
Oh,
have to
Victor
watch
talking
that.
video.
Yeah, yeah, and then I watch it, and then there's 3 hours, right? And then there's a whole
Mm.
bunch of more recommended ones that all look good. And then sometimes it will take me days just to leave the English account on my phone
Ah,
because I like immediately have like 10 videos I like need to watch, right? And
yeah.
and, and I hate it. Like it's like I'm a prisoner of it, right?
Mm.
Because it's like, oh, I have this guilt that I could be watching Japanese and really these videos are not really benefiting me, yet I feel like I have to watch them because they look like interesting, so that's why I whenever I have this setup where I'm only watching English videos on the computer where there's no recommended, and on my phone it's only Japanese, I'm always way more happy, right? So I think using like these browser extensions, making other YouTube accounts, trying to like once you see the English YouTube video, then you're kind of fucked because like you want to watch it, and even if you choose not to, it still pains you because you feel like you're missing out, right? You have this like FOMO, and so it's better to just not know it exists. So to try to, in a way, like make your environment so that you don't even see the temptations, like they don't even, you don't become aware of them. The only thing that you're surrounded by is things in your target language. That makes it a lot easier to do. And that's what I was doing when I was learning Japanese. Like I did everything in Japanese. So like in a way I couldn't even relate to a lot of the other people around me because they'd be talking about some new Netflix drama and I wouldn't know about it, but I wasn't gonna look it up or whatever. I try to just zone it out, tune it out because I knew I just wanted to stick with doing Japanese stuff.
That's absolutely gold what you said here. I think it's so practical. It's crazy. So the first thing is it's proactively creating the environment that wouldn't even have those distractions in the first place, so that you don't have to burn your willpower not to do something. The second thing is completely reframing educational process, purely educational process, as something of entertainment where you just get kind of points for doing something. One thing I wanted to add here, I'm not sure whether you kind of familiar with how I like my approach of to learning languages. One of the things is that I recommend is not only textbooks, but I'm really a big fan of time tracking. So basically,
Hmm.
when you track your time, you kind of get the points because a lot of apps they give you like those fake points like Duolingo that don't really matter.
Hmm.
But what I think matters the most when it comes to language learning is your time, which is the ultimate kind of investment that you can visualize. And a lot of people, especially when they don't reach level in the language after studying for a few months, they think there is something wrong with them. But if you start tracking your time, you can visually see that oh, the actually time tracking is like you can see that the time that you've already put in into learning the language you've already invested it's also almost like points that you get. So
Hmm.
I myself when I was learning languages I've been tracking time in Excel spreadsheets for so many years now, probably like 10 plus years. So for me this what you've said is I would call like gamification of the process,
Hmm.
where it's like finding words, like of guessing. It's like a challenge, some kind of points that you get. I think it's absolute gold. I think this kind of that we actually because a lot of people talk about like exposing themselves. Oh, you should listen, you should watch. But what are the actual steps that they can do? That I think your story and your response is extremely practical for language learners all around the world to start exposing themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
I just want to also say, like, yeah, I'm also a big fan of time tracking. So yeah, definitely.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
how our app just started, 60 Lingo. It started as a time tracking tool, basically. So
Hmm.
just track your time when learning a foreign language. That's it. Like, so it started as this, but now it has more functions. But basically, this is what we were inspired with because time tracking is just such a great thing. Can you share how you tracked your time and how it inspired you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing is tracking what you're actually doing, right? So for me,
Mm,
I didn't track time per se. I mean, I kind of did, but every day I split my immersion into reading and listening. And for my reading, I would track how many pages I did, and I'd always compare myself to like the previous day, and I'd have a goal of how many pages I was trying to read. And like it would be in a way it's kind of like time tracking because it takes me roughly the same amount of time to read a page, right? So it's whether I'm tracking the minutes versus the pages in a way, it's not that big of a difference. And for the listening, it was even closer to it basically was time tracking, but for the vast majority of what I was doing when I was studying Japanese was watching anime, and every anime episode is the same length. So I would
mm,
basically keep track of how many anime episodes I watched as my
mm,
time. So my goal was to watch at least like six every day. I didn't do it every day, but that's basically like a little over 2 hours because every anime episode is like 20 minutes, but sometimes it takes longer to get through it if you're like looking stuff up or whatever. And if I watched a drama, that's generally like 40 minutes per episode, so I'd count those as like two anime episodes. So I kind of had that's kind of how I kept track of it in my head of, I would keep track. I had my goal, and then I keep track if I exceeded my goal or if I did better than yesterday, and kind of like that, just because that's like what was easy for me, I guess.
So basically, moving on to the next question is language parent. I like this term. Is first thing is finding a language parent and copying and doing shadowing. So basically, you choose a YouTube video or some kind of audio, and you do shadowing. And this is the first thing. Second thing is recording a video of yourself speaking for, let's say, 10 minutes or 5 minutes, and trying to spot your mistakes. The third thing that you've mentioned before was recording. Just recording yourself speaking and comparing it to the original audio if you have it of a native speaker speaking and spotting your mistakes from there. So these are the things that you've mentioned on the output side. Once you start doing output, is there anything in particular that people can that you would recommend now to language learners that they can do in order to sound native like you?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I don't think I knew about when I made that video, but I'm a big fan of now is what's called chorusing, which is kind of like shadowing, but a lot more powerful. It's basically where you take like a single sentence in the target language and you open it in some audio editing program like Audacity and you put it on repeat so that you have the same exact recording of the same single sentence over and over with like a small gap in between. And you listen to it for a while and try to hear all the nuances of it, and then you repeat over it in perfect unison. So like the idea with shadowing is that you're listening to a native speaker speak, and then as soon as possible, you're trying to repeat back exactly what you're hearing, right? But you don't know what they're saying ahead of time, right? So there's always going to be at least like a second of lag. Like you hear something, a second later you say it, right? So there's and then the intention is that you compare what you're hearing to what you're saying, and if you hear any deviations, you can fix them. When you really
Mm,
think about it, right? Because there's like a 1 second delay between when you hear something, when you say something, you're not really comparing what you're saying to the recording. You're comparing it to your memory of the recording. And that memory is about 1 second old. And so, especially when you're not a native speaker, the like resolution of that recording in your brain, it actually drops a lot in that 1 second, right? Like the difference between your memory of it versus the thing itself is actually quite different. Whereas with chorusing, because it's the same exact sentence over and over and over, you can say it in 100% unison with no lag.
what's the resource once again? Corsia?
Chorusing. So it's just like you can chorus, like if there's like a choir
Chorusing?
chorus,
Chorusing.
chorusing.
It's the name of this, right? So
C
Corrsing.
O U R S I N G.
Coursing. Okay, coursing. Okay. Course like course, but ing at the end.
Yeah, it was like created by this Swedish
Uh,
linguist, I think.
mm,
But yeah, basically, yeah, when you're shadowing, there's this second 1 second lag between your when you're hearing something when you're saying it, right? So you're basically when you're comparing your own pronunciation to your 1 second old memory of the recording.
mm,
And if you're not a native speaker, that memory, it's not going to be nearly as high resolution as the actual recording itself, right? Whereas when you're doing chorusing, since it's the same sentence, the exact same recording of the sentence over and over and over, you can say it at the exact same time as the recording. And because it's the exact same time with no lag, you can hear more intuitively whether there's any discrepancies between what you're saying and what the recording's saying, right? It's kind of like when two people are trying to sing the same musical note
mm,
and one of them, one person's a little bit off from the other person, you can intuitively hear this lack of harmony, right? Whereas when they reach the perfectly same note, you do hear that harmony. So you can kind of get the same effect with your own pronunciation, whether you're perfectly pronouncing this one sentence or not. And so the
mm,
idea is that there's actually a very few number of sounds in in every language, right? Like less than 100 and vowels and consonants combined in most languages, right? And so if you can have like a set of like 20 sentence, like if you just take like a random 20, 30 sentences, you're probably going to cover every single sound in the language. And so if you do this technique and master just like 20 or 30 sentences, then that in theory is enough to get a perfect accent. Or, there's other aspects of accent, but at least that will give you like perfect vowels and consonants and help you really pick up the prosody, like the rhythm and the intonation of the language.
So,
So
but you're not recording yourself while doing that. You just repeat like you sing a song together with somebody, right?
I think it is good to record. Like the original method doesn't talk about recording, I don't think, but the way that I did it and I teach people to do it is first you can do it in like three sections. Like first you just listen to it, just input, and then you're repeating over it, and then you're listening back to what it sounded like when you were repeating it.
Mm,
And you kind of do that in a cycle over and over. And then I find that gives like the best results.
great, awesome. So, yeah, basically, yeah, coursing. So try to put the link
Yeah.
below.
And I think shadowing is still helpful too, but it's less good for like nailing in your vowels and your consonant, and it's more good for kind of just grasping the overall flow or vibe of your parent.
Mm, yeah. So, language parents. So basically, the stage where at which you should find a language parent is when you can kind of understand most of what you're exposing yourself to, right? Like
I
90% or
mean,
something
it's
like this.
never too early. Like you can start as
Oh,
early as you want because I mean, it's not going to harm you, right? Like
mm,
it's only going to help. But it becomes more important when you're gearing up to start outputting because the parent is kind of and you can have more than one, but your parent/parents are who you're going to try to model when you speak. So, you want to have that model kind of in place before you start speaking a lot. But it also, if you can start using your having a parrot from day one, and then it will also play the role of helping you build your comprehension, right? So it's never too early, but but it can be too late, basically. I mean, not too late, but you want, if you haven't done it by the time you're gearing up to start outputting a lot, that's when you'd want to get started with that.
So do you have any recommendations for this kind of this search of a language parent? Um, for example, if I don't know anybody, like anybody on YouTube who speaks Japanese, or um, so that's the first thing. And should their videos have in Japanese subtitles? Should you visually see what you're watching, or it's not necessarily necessary?
Yeah, good question. I mean, actually, it's really, really hard to find a parent. It doesn't seem like it would be that hard in theory, but in practice it is. Partly because like when you're learning a language, you don't know how a certain person actually sounds to native speakers, right? Like you don't know if somebody sounds confident or charismatic or nerdy or, you know, there's going to be a specific perception that natives tend to have of that person, and if you're not at native level yet, you're not going to share that perception. So I actually think that it's really ideal to kind of work with a native speaker friend or teacher to try to find a parent and ask them like, what do you think of this person speaking? Like, do you think they sound cool? What is your vibe of them? Like, if I spoke like this, what would you think? And and I think that that's pretty important because, for example, like to give like just talk about myself, like for a long time I used this guy called Hiroyuki as my parent, and he seemed really ideal for a lot of reasons. Like I liked him as a content creator. Like he has a literally probably like tens of thousands of hours of him talking. Okay, maybe not, but like close. Like crazy amounts of hours of him just sitting and talking, and he talks about a lot of different topics. And he's from Tokyo, so he's speaks standard language, and he he's like a smart, intellectual, logical guy. So I kind of vibed with that. But looking back now, he kind of sounds like, I don't know, I wouldn't really want to talk like him in real life. He said that he's like a
But you
little
shadowed him for such a long time.
like yeah, I mean, if you talked like him, you would kind of sound like he kind of has that vibe of like that guy that's like always picking an argument with you, even when he doesn't have to. It's kind of like that annoying, like, well, like, that like it wouldn't really seem fun to have him at a party type of vibe.
Mm,
So yeah, now I realize like, okay, I wouldn't really want to talk like him, right? So but I couldn't really tell that at the time. So, and I even remember at the time I like showed a Japanese person and him, and I was like, "Hey, what do you think he sounds like?" Like, I remember I showed it to like a Japanese friend that I had who was a girl, and she was just like, he sounds like a middle-aged man. Like he sounds like Oji-san." And
yeah.
I was like, "Do you think I should talk like that?" She was like, "No, that'd be gross if you talk like that." But I was too stuck in my mind. I was like, "Ah, fuck you. I like this guy. I'm gonna do it anyway." But yeah, in hindsight, that was telling, right? Like she knew before I could know myself, right? So yeah, I think you should work with the native speaker. Maybe even just ask them, be like, "Hey, who do you think sounds really cool, right? Who do
Mm.
you like to listen to? Who's like style speaking?" So
Should their videos have subtitles? Well, like when you do exposure, like when you do input, you call it input, I call it exposure from the book
yeah.
How We Learn. It's called Massive Exposure. But basically, should their videos have subtitles, so it's not necessary?
I don't think it's necessary because by the time you get to the point where you're really using that parent as a parent, like as a model for the way you're going to speak, you should already understand most of it without that many difficulties
Mm.
anyway. So maybe it's a nice to have, but I don't think it should be necessary.
Do you have a recommendation for language parent for speaking Japanese so that all of us, like I don't know how many people see
Yeah,
this,
well,
but like thousands of people can just go to that YouTube channel, just like all of us just copy how
maybe
to
this
speak.
will be controversial, but I think if you're a guy and you want to sound cool, like you want to be the type of guy that like girls think is cool, then I think Kimu Taku. That's actually who I kind of want to
Oh,
emulate more myself.
so how do it's like Kimotaku?
His full name's Kimura Takuya.
Kimutaku.
Kimura Takuya.
Kimura Takuya. Okay, so I'll go to their YouTube channel and
So
try
so
to.
so he's an actor,
Mm,
and so here's the why I realize he's good. Well, first of all, he's like just like every Japanese person admits he's like a sexy badass. Like,
Mm,
he's super charismatic and super ikemen, which is like the Japanese word for like, you know, really just cool, badass, the type of guy you'd want
mm,
to be, basically. And he's originally an actor. So his like he since like the mid 90s, he's been in a lot of dramas. So the nice thing about that is if you're watching a drama, you can see how he speaks in everyday life situations. Because on a YouTube
mm,
video, you're generally sitting in front of a camera and talking, and that's a little bit different than the way you're interacting with other people, right? So you get to see the way he talks to his boss. You get to see the way he talks to coworkers that are male. You get to see the way he talks to friends. You get to see the way he talks to girls, right? You gets to see how he talks to his girlfriend because he's in all these different imaginary scenarios in the drama, right? But he also used to do a radio show. So in Japan, radio is still a thing that people listen to. It's
mm,
it's basically the equivalent of podcasts, and he used to do this basically podcast radio show. And so if you search his name and then radio in YouTube, you can find the recordings of it. So there's just like hours and hours and hours of recordings of him basically just talking into a microphone by himself. So you can also hear what he sounds like when he's off script, when he's just spontaneously talking. He's not acting, right? And there's like an unlimited amount of that content, right? He also has an actual YouTube channel. I mean, now he's kind of like a middle-aged man. He's like in his 50s, I think. Still sounds cool. But
mm.
you can also, if you want to see him, see what he's like now and stuff like that. So there's just a ton of content of him in many different forms, and he sounds like a badass. And you should, if you're a guy, you should probably want to talk like him.
We're gonna be talking like him, just like thousands of people, like
Yeah.
army of people talking.
And
So,
the other thing, like, so I was actually talking about this with a Japanese friend the other day. It's like the way he talks
mm,
is like so badass, it's a little exaggerated, right? So if you
mm,
literally were like a clone of him, it would be kind of cartoonish. But the thing
mm,
is, like, that phrase, like, shoot for the stars, end of the moon, or forget the other one,
mm.
shoot the moon, never for the
Yeah,
stars.
yeah, yeah.
Like, basically, like, if you're not going to sound exactly like him. If you try to aim for him, you probably won't get there, and you not getting there will be like perfect, basically.
Mm.
So that's part of it too.
Yeah, so I just heard this story from one of my friends learning Japanese. He speaks Japanese, but he said that this interesting thing that um, it also kind of your Japanese kind of depends on who you're learning from, and you consciously or unconsciously have a language parent. Everybody has a language parent, who
Mm,
consciously or unconsciously. People think that might think that language parent is something that we choose or not choose. You already have it because basically you just automatically mimic the person that you learn from, and a lot of unfortunately language Japanese, from what I think every language is like this, to be honest, but in Chinese, when we were learning Chinese, I just caught myself talking like a girl in a lot of languages because I would just interact with females most of the time.
mm,
And I mean, when I was learning Chinese, I would be like, like at the beginning, just adding ya at the end. It was like it's a very like a feminine thing, like no maybe in Japanese, like adding
mm.
no all the time. And it would sound so feminine. And I remember the girl I was dating at the time, she said, "Why would you just talk like a girl? How they are? Like nobody speaks like this." And I remember, and then I get back to my classroom, and one of the people that I was learning from, he just like he used this "yeah" at the end of every sentence just to sound cool and natural. And I said, "Dude, like just nobody speaks like this. This is just how girls speak." And just he was like, "Yeah, what?" And so basically, he was kind of shocked. And the same with Japanese. One of my friends who speaks Japanese, he said there are a lot of like there are a lot of situations where guys end up learning feminine Japanese because they learn from a female teacher. But my case was when I was just interacting 24/7, even in Korean. I mean, my exposure was I was just kind of learning through talking a lot. I would go through those textbooks and I was learning through talking. And what ended up happening was that I didn't get the enough of the masculine input of the
Mm.
language, and this is what happened with me when I was learning those languages. So there are a lot of like intonation or grammar points that may be mostly used by females, and I think that's people just have a language parent without even them realizing that. So it's kind of the thing that it's not that you choose it or not. It's kind of the thing that people should be careful about. I think it's like
Yeah.
they should be
Yeah.
really careful about it.
Yeah, no, no, 100%. Yeah, I agree. And like the other thing is that you can always change it later, right? Like
Mm,
if you realize, okay, I'm kind of talking in a way that's a little more feminine than I should, and you can get more masculine input, you can change it. But there's also an aspect where like the very first version of the language that you learn is the one that's like most deeply rooted in your head, and you'll be liable to slip up and slip back into that at various points when you're like tired or maybe drinking or something like that.
Yeah,
So like I definitely found that kind of happened where like for me, my kind of parent was like anime. And in
yeah,
anime, they speak in kind of really exaggerated, kind of corny way. And I used to sound more like that when I spoke Japanese, and then I got more, natural input and I kind of fixed it. But sometimes I'll be tempted to slip up because it's still like down there as like my base of the language. So that's why yeah, it's something that you definitely want to be aware of from the beginning.
you said, I remember in one interview, you says like when I get drunk, I speak like anime character. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah.
definitely gotten better with experience. Actually, the funny thing is now when I get drunk, I speak in Kansai Ben sometimes because when
Mm,
I first moved to Japan, I lived in Osaka, and like I I was always conflicted about what to do with because in Osaka they speak a different dialect that is really cool, but it's really specific. And so I didn't want to butcher the dialect. I wanted to speak it, but if I was going to speak it, I wanted to speak it like perfectly. And the pitch accent system is super complicated in Kansai Ben, like twice as complicated as
mm,
standard Japanese, basically.
mm,
And so I would speak when I lived in Osaka, I would speak in the dialect when I knew how to say it in the dialect, and when I didn't, I wouldn't kind of fake it. I would just say it in standard Japanese. But when I was drunk, then I wouldn't care as much, so I just speak it Kansai Ben, like full on, kind of more like intuitively, and I probably made a bunch of mistakes, but I didn't care because I was drunk and no one cared. And so sometimes now when I still get drunk, it like brings back the part of me that was when I lived in Kansai, and I'll like want to speak Kansai Ben. I mean, not as much anymore because I've been living in Tokyo for like almost a year now. But
mm.
if I talk to someone from Kansai, it'll come up. If I talk to someone from Kansai and I get drunk, it will like come back like very quickly.
Yeah, you kind of slip to like the old version of the language that you learned. Yeah, so um yeah, so basically the question that I have, I just want to go through the questions on the question that I have is if I had a personal tutor that would be available 24/7 to help me with learning Japanese at the beginning as a complete beginner, what would that tutor do? Like what would be the most important function in your personal opinion?
To just give you constant comprehensible input, basically. Like I just have them like talk to you nonstop, whether or not you understand, but try to
Mm,
help you understand. And at the
mm,
beginning, I would speak back to them mostly in English. And but even when I speak back in English, they would speak back in Japanese. So
ah,
maybe they're saying in Japanese like the equivalent of like, "Hey, can you hand me my phone?" But they're
mm,
just like, "Hey, ちょっとスマホ取って." But you don't know what they're
mm,
saying, right? And you're like, "What? What does that mean?" スマホ取って.
mm.
スマホだよ. あれだよ. Oh,
あ
oh, what? You mean phone? そうそうそうそうそう, スマホだよ.
うん、
And then that way you can kind of like learn just through comprehensible input. And because they're adapting to you and responding to you in the moment, they can make it comprehensible, right?
う
They
ん、
can do hand signs, they can point to things, they can repeat it, the same thing in many different ways. And a comprehensible input's the most effective way to acquire the language. And so yeah, I would want them to just be constantly speaking to me nonstop and trying to and like comprehensible input. And then I would try to speak to them if I thought I knew how to say something organically. Like if it just pops into my head and I can feel like, oh, this is something I acquired, and
うん、
I'll just then I would say it, but I wouldn't try to force output. I would if I couldn't think of a natural way to say it without too much effort, I would just speak in English. But I would also have them correct me really strictly whenever I did say something in the language and it was wrong.
Hmm. It's your position of the on the output is really interesting because how I used to acquire languages, I would just used to think a lot and like before I say something, it's almost like a calculation like you do with like especially with Korean with conjugations or when it comes to Chinese, like when it comes to tones, you have to like think, oh, what is the tone change? Like, and how you would do that it's like until you feel it's natural you wouldn't say it, right? You wouldn't be like like, oh, in this conjugation I should like say short form or tap form before this grammar, so you wouldn't be thinking like that. It would be like completely natural to you, right?
Yeah, basically.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's
And
really
that's why
interesting.
speaking Japanese now does feel like totally natural because
Hmm.
I think like that part I think the part of your brain that you use when you allow your brain to figure it out naturally without consciously thinking about it is actually a totally different part of your brain than the part of your brain you use when you're consciously doing the conjugation. And so when you in that unconscious part of your brain that does it naturally, that's what we use in our native language. And so that's what allows you to sound and function like a native, and it's just way more powerful. So that conscious
Mm,
part of your brain, it's just it's not very good at it. So like when I see people, like I know a lot of foreigners who've been living in Japan for a long time, and a lot of them that are fluent in Japanese. And the ones that learned that way through like consciously doing the conjugation, like they always sound more unnatural and they always have lower
mm,
accuracy. Like it always, you can
mm,
almost see like the gears turning in their head when they're speaking because you can see that they're like trying to think about the conjugations, and they always
mm,
make more like certain mistakes very consistently, and like it just feels a little more clunky when they're speaking. So, like, yeah, because the different parts of your brain are different, it's not a matter of you can just use the conscious part and practice it a whole bunch and then you'll be like a native, right? Because the native's using a whole different part of your brain. So I think my method's trying to optimize for using the same parts of your brain that than you use for when you're speaking your native language. But the
mm,
exception for me was like I didn't pick up pitch accent naturally. And so later when I wanted to like fix the pitch accent of my Japanese, I had to consciously learn that. And I had to do what you're saying of like consciously think about it while I'm speaking and practice that as a skill. And because I have practiced that a lot, I'm like very good at it now. And my pitch accent accuracy is like very, very high, but it's not like 100% perfect. And, you know, if I'm extra tired or I haven't been speaking Japanese as much recently, I'll make more mistakes. And that's because it's something I learned consciously rather than something that I picked up naturally, you know.
that's really interesting. I mean, because yeah, it's so you have like thousands of exposure on some grammar patterns. You don't have to think about it, so you just say it. And then when it comes to pitch accents, so how you do it, you just kind of develop a muscle memory, but it's still kind of a little bit more rational, so it's
Mhm.
less reliable. Yeah, that's a really interesting
Whereas I
theory.
never make grammar mistakes, like ever. If I
Yeah,
do, it's like the same as if I made one in English. Like I like immediately know it's wrong and like fix it. And it's very, very rare.
yeah. So how I discovered what happened for me was that at the beginning I use this conjugation thinking process, but then in the future it becomes more natural and just kind of this thinking process almost disappears or happens kind of more in the background. But yeah, it's that's definitely a very interesting perspective on that. So you don't say something unless it's very natural to you already, unless you 100% know it. Yeah, what would you recommend to a person like me who has already finished Genki 1, Genki 2, or any kind of textbooks just like them, about around like N4 going to N3? My story is kind of it's kind of really weird and unique because I already can understand maybe most of Japanese kanji if I just look at them, just because they look like Chinese ones and the meaning is similar, but I cannot read them. And like you said, like I see them on the screen like popping up, and if the Japanese teacher send the kanji to me of whatever words, I don't know, 90% of the case I know what's the meaning. But the problem is that when it's too fast, like on the screen, even subtitles, I cannot catch like the overall meaning of the sentence. Um, so my maybe like the understanding of kanji is kind of better than just like N4 and 3 level,
Mm.
but still like for people who like on Genki 1, Genki 2, just like finishing those textbooks, or finish just a couple texts, what would you recommend to them at this stage of learning? Should they still be holding themselves from speaking if they want to develop more perfect accent or pronunciation or speaking style? And what would you do at that point? Would you just completely drop the textbooks and just do? Would you proceed with textbooks after that? Would you just do massive exposure without speaking until you just get all the sense? Like, well, would you do the same thing basically that you did back in the day, or would you change anything?
Well, there's definitely something I would change. So, I mean, yeah, the number one thing, like you said, is after Genki 2, I think that's enough of like primers, enough like priming yourself for exposure. And I would just do full-time exposure.
Mm,
Because the thing is, like, yeah, maybe there's some things that you didn't learn from the textbooks, right? But you can just look them up on the spot. Like, especially now that we have Chat GPT, like at
mm,
any time you can just paste a sentence into Chat GPT and be like, explain to me this sentence. Explain to me what's happening with the grammar, right? And it'll just explain it to you like in context. So that's why you don't, yeah, you don't need to prepare ahead of time. You can just learn it as you come across it, you know, as you go. For me, what I would do if I could go back is I would have focused more on listening and less on reading, because this goes back to what I was saying with like there's two different parts of your brain you can use to learn a language, right? You can use that more conscious part or you can use the unconscious, more intuitive part. And when you're reading, you're especially in the beginning, you're mostly using that conscious part, right? Because you can go at your own pace, you can look up the words, you can take your time to think about the grammar. Whereas when you're listening, it's so fast you can't really keep up consciously. So you're kind of forced to just fall back on your, unconscious intuitive parts of your brain. And so I think the more that you involve that conscious part of your brain, then the less natural your language use is going to be in the end, both in terms of how it feels subjectively and how you sound to other people. Because you're literally not doing what native speakers did, right? Native speakers use pretty much exclusively that unconscious part of your brain, at least for like speaking. And then later they learn how to read after they're already fluent in like listening and speaking, right? So I think the more that you emulate that, then the more natural you'll sound. And so, for example, because for me, I was doing like a lot, I was doing both reading and listening, but I did a lot of reading the whole time. And so, when you're reading, like I said, you're using that conscious part of your brain, and you're also kind of like potentially reinforcing bad pronunciation because, you're sub-vocalizing, you're kind of reading it with that voice in your head, and the voice in your head's not going to have perfect pronunciation yet. And so I think, for example, like I said, I didn't acquire pitch accent naturally. I think that's part of, well, I think the main reason for that is because I did too much reading early on. I didn't learn enough just through
Mm.
listening. I think and through all those different factors. So if I could go back, I would have put off reading. I would have done a lot of reading later, but until I was kind of more fluent in the spoken language, I would have done very light reading, I think.
So basically, if you divide these kind of activities like listening versus reading when it comes to learning a foreign language, reading, like the efficiency of reading is not even close to listening. I actually completely agree with that.
Well,
Completely
it depends
agree.
what you mean by efficiency, because you can learn faster in the short term by reading,
Yeah.
but but it's kind
But
of
the
like a
quality,
trade-off,
not the
you know.
efficiency, but the quality. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, the
yeah.
quality is lower. Like it's faster but lower quality, right? It's like fast food for language learning, I guess.
Would you call, because from what you've said, it's kind of the interesting thing that actually kind of when I was watching your videos and like my very first thing that I said on my YouTube channel is before even everything started, I was really interested in subconscious learning, like
Hmm.
how you learn the language using subconscious mind. And this was just like one of the very first videos that I put out on my channel, just which were education, like some of educational videos, like the very first one, so how to use a subconscious mind to learn for languages. And it purely started from exposure, like the same thing that you're talking about. I'm a massive like fan of this of exposure effect and everything. Um and there are a couple books that I like, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman,
Hmm.
like a lot of research on how we learn using subconscious mind. Would you call your approach like how to learn Japanese using subconscious mind or something like this? Would you call it like this generally?
Yeah, I mean, what I generally recommend people to do is not 100% unconscious, right? I
Mm,
actually think that if the ideal way to learn a language would be 100% unconscious, because
mm,
that's how we learned our native language, right? Completely unconscious. So if you want to be achieve the same result as a native, I think you should use the same process as a native. But the thing is, we were able to do that with our native language because we had access to a huge amount of really high quality input, right? And also, when you're an infant, you're forced to just listen to tons of input, even though you don't understand it at all. Whereas and so at the very beginning, that's when it's going to be really like, let's say you're taking a true, just comprehensible input approach. At the very beginning, you're understanding almost nothing, and you're not looking at anything up. You're just sitting there, letting it wash over you. Like as an adult, that's going to be really excruciating to do. And especially like you're not going to be able to find input that's like perfectly comprehensible. And so because of that, I still like when I say like you should do a primer, right? Like when you're using a textbook, that's already not that's still conscious, right?
mm,
The way that I try, and I still recommend looking up words and making flashcards, right? These are all things that do involve your conscious mind. In general, these things that I recommend, they're not for the purpose of you using your conscious mind to speak. It's you're using your conscious mind to make input more comprehensible. And then through comprehending the input, you acquire it unconsciously. And then once you've acquired it, then you can speak naturally. So it's kind of like a two-step process. So like I still recommend doing conscious study, but the difference between me and a lot of other people is most people use the conscious study directly to produce the language through translating in their head, whereas I'm recommending people to use this conscious knowledge that they study just to make the input more comprehensible so that then they can like acquire it, basically. But I do think that when you're doing that, you're still, you know, you're making the process deviate from what a native would do, and it'll probably have some effects to that, right?
mm,
Like in
mm,
general, when I look at people who've gotten really good at a foreign language, like the people who did the least study and the most just picking it up naturally through mass exposure generally sound the most natural and the most close to native speaker. And the more
Mm.
that people like did lots of study and lots of reading early on, like the more they sound very foreign when they speak the
Mm.
language.
Yeah, so I found myself when let's say I just want to say a sentence naturally like sometimes I sound natural to myself, sometimes I don't sound natural. I just kind of compared it, and I realized if I don't think when I speak, I kind of sound more natural.
Mm,
And there was also the thing that in some of my videos I mentioned this term. I saw you mentioning it, but you didn't like term like you didn't use any term for that. The interesting thing is I call it subliminal retrieval.
mm,
I haven't seen any papers on like scientific papers on it, like any research or anybody speaking about it. But there is this really huge phenomenon. I think you experienced it massively when you because basically it's how you acquire the language is when you let's say you look at some kanji or some let's say you want to figure out how something is translated or the meaning or you want to solve some problem and then you kind of distract yourself for a few seconds or a few minutes and do something else, your subconscious brain is doing some calculations in the
mm,
background, and then all of a sudden, without you realizing that you have an answer to this question,
mm,
and it's like this what I call like subliminal retrieval because it's retrieval because it still retrieves from your kind of memory bank of your of like you play or like subconsciously works on it, and it's subliminal because you're not even taking any effort to solve this. But so I think it's kind of also related to if you do a lot of input, you become more natural because you subconsciously retrieve information, and also because it's just faster, like you said, subconscious mind is much faster. It's like almost like muscle memory. So yeah, that's a really interesting thing I wanted to mention. So I myself, I just find myself just like kind of suppressing myself to go on just like massive rant about like kind of fake polyglots or people who a little bit like misrepresent what it actually takes to speak the language. To be honest, to be just completely honest and just open, even I myself, when I say that I speak 5 languages, I sometimes I cringe a little bit because in Japanese, well, I can have like a short conversation in Japanese. I mean, all my classes when I'm learning Japanese now are only in Japanese, so I can understand a lot of stuff. And now I'm studying like intermediate level of Japanese. But the thing is that still, like adding this language to a list of my languages is a little bit. Sometimes I feel a little bit uncomfortable because to me, speaking a language actually means having unlimited hours of conversations, like unlimited. So whatever, like I can speak English now for like like infinite hours, and I can speak Chinese for the same. Like I don't have to like limit myself, and I can talk about diverse topics. I can, if I started to work at a Chinese company at the beginning, it will be a little bit hard, but then I'll just learn extremely quickly. And Korean, I mean, I was working in Korean companies for years, and I've been immersed in the culture for a long time. I still have a lot to learn in all those languages, but I consider myself fluent in those. But the thing is that when I say 5 languages, like this, that last one's like Japanese, like I want to become fluent in it so that it's like I don't feel this uncomfortable feeling. And so the reason why I was saying all those things is because people add the languages to their list, and it's like the list ends up being like so long, like 10 languages, 13 languages, 20 languages. But the most of the languages that are on their list don't really they can't really speak them for like 2 hours, 3 hours, like unlimited number of time. And when I'm saying, by the way, unlimited number of time, people think, but it's fluent. It's not fluent. Like you can speak for hours even if you're intermediate. Like I can speak for hours. I can speak Japanese, like broken Japanese with you for hours, with no limit. But it like I might not understand everything you say. I'll be able to express a lot of things, but it will be like a child kind of Japanese. So this is how I talk to my teacher. So basically, it doesn't mean that. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that those people they can't uh, like they add those languages to the list, and they're really to be honest, I think they're really weak in those languages. And to me, it's like the question that I always have is like, but why do you just learn the language to this extent? And then you just move on to learn for example, I'm learning Japanese now. I don't move like to learn Spanish right at the same time while being like like while speaking like broken Japanese. And they're just like keep moving to the next language, like adding this number. Now it's 7, now it's 8 languages. But actually, he's maybe like pretty decent, like Spanish, English, and like some other language. But then it's like he claims to speak, let's say, 13 or 20 or 25. this number of languages. So from my perspective, as a person who actually experienced language learning on in terms of actually like working at a company only with those with like let's say Korean people and like actually learning a language on the level so that I can do documentation in those languages and actually go through the situations that require the highest level of proficiency, which can't even be measured by the test. But the thing is that I was kind of curious about your opinion. Did you feel like negative emotions about it, like about those people, or because you yourself you learned just one language straight for like 10 years and then you see like oh sometimes people around, hey, I speak 20 languages, this is my phrase, ha ha ha, and then you see like those different people, like what did you feel about it? And I was kind of curious. And then when people talk to you sometimes, like or about you, or have you experienced that or not? I don't know, but somebody talked to something like this, like in comments, I noticed they're like, "Oh, Victor, but you speak only five languages, or like four languages, or whatever, three languages. But I know this guy, he speaks 10 languages. Ha ha, he's better than you." So like this kind of number measurement type of thing. So like, what would you think? What do you think about it, and what's your kind of journey with it?
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, so like for me personally, like when I was learning Japanese, I wasn't interested in languages. I was just interested in Japanese. Like before I started learning Japanese, I never had even thought about seriously learning a foreign language. So for
Mm,
me at the beginning, like it was like all I just wanted to speak Japanese. I didn't give a crap about any other language. So it wasn't on my mind. Like the idea of being a
mm,
polyglot, I didn't care about at all. Um, I just felt like, oh, I don't have that interest. And then the more I
mm,
learned Japanese, then I kind of wanted to learn Chinese, and then it started to seem cool to learn other languages. It's kind of like I was kind of like infected by that. But for me too, it's kind of like it just really even after I became more interested in learning other languages, it never appealed to me because like I like if you once you learn a language, right, you have to either maintain it or forget it. And in my mind, if you're going to forget it, what was the point of learning it in the first place, right? I wasn't interested in learning something just to forget it. And so if I'm going to learn it, I have to maintain it. If I'm going to maintain it, that means I have to regularly spend time in it on a regular basis, right? Spend time with that language, listening, speaking that language. And I felt that the experience of spending time in a language that you're not like hyper fluent in is a subpar experience, right? Like,
mm,
why would I watch a video in Spanish and like understand three-fourths and have to really struggle when I could watch a very similar, almost same video in English and understand 100% effortlessly, right? So it's like I'm fine to do that, to every once in a while in Spanish because I'm sure Spanish will be. And I'm just using Spanish as an example. I don't speak any Spanish, but um, there of course every language has its own unique flavor, and you can enjoy that flavor. But like, I don't want to be regularly spending time in a language that I suck at unless I'm on the I'm on a path to get really good at it, right? And so for me, like getting mediocre at a language and then calling it quits was just never something that appealed to me at all, like whatsoever. For me, it's either like I'm going to get really, really good at it so that when I regularly spend time in that language to maintain it, it's not a subpar experience because I understand it extremely well and I can use it extremely well, or I'm not even going to start learning it because what's the point? And that was what I thought for a long time. Now I'm getting like a little bit more lenient on that because like like I'm not planning on getting super super fluent in Korean. I think the process of learning Korean I would be enjoyable and insightful in a lot of ways, right? So I'm almost getting into it more for the process. And I know it'll be fun to get to use a little bit even if I suck when I run into a Korean or something, right? So yeah, I guess over time I've actually become like a little bit more open-minded with regards to that. But I think like when you look at like those people that you're kind of talking about, where it's like they know a tiny bit of like 10 languages or whatever, like uh I mean everyone's different, right? Like ultimately, I think you can break language learning down into two different types, right? Language learning that you do because you have a necessity or like you have a need, and language learning you're doing just as a hobby for fun, and there's not really a lot of practicality to it. And most of the language learning that we're talking about in this language learning community online is this one that you're just doing as a hobby and you don't really need to, right? It's like if you speak English really fluently, there's very rare circumstances unless where you really need to learn another language. I mean, like if you get up and move to Korea or move to Japan, I'll put that under the category of you have a need, right? Like, hey, you're now living in the country and you're getting held back by your language ability. Okay, we can put that in need. But these people that are like trying to become polyglots, they don't have any need, right? It's just a hobby. And so, okay, if someone's learning language because it's their hobby, then you know it, it's hard to really knock them for it in a sense because it's like, well, they could just be playing video games, right? At least they're learning something. Like, yeah, maybe they're not getting good at any of their languages and they're just learning like a tiny bit of language after language after language. But there's a lot that's still more productive than a lot of hobbies they could have, right? Where they're just be sitting on the couch and watching movies in English all day or something, right? Or like something, even, doing drugs or something like that. Like at least it's kind of productive. But on one sense, there's that, right? It's like, okay, it's their hobby, they're doing it for fun, so you can't really criticize them for it. But the other thing is like when you're just thinking about like, okay, let's say you take on the hobby of language learning, like what's going to add more like meaning to your life? Like learning a little bit of a lot of language or learning a significant amount of a much fewer number of language. It's very hard to make the argument that learning a tiny bit of like 10, 15 languages is what's going to add more meaning to your life. Right? I think almost anyone, even those people would probably, a lot of them would admit themselves like, yeah, if I took on less languages and I spent more time with each language and went deeper, that would that would be a more meaningful experience. That would like add more total meaning of that I derive from this hobby. And I think the reason that most of these type of people don't do that is simply because they they have like shiny new object syndrome and they kind of have an ADHD problem where, whenever you're studying one language for a while, the excitement wears off after a certain point. And the idea of starting a brand new language from scratch is going to sound a lot more new and exciting and, dopamine stimulating than sticking with the language that you're already getting a little bit bored of, right? And so when you give into that shiny new object allure, then that's what puts you on this path to speak a little bit of a bunch of languages. And in a way, I think it's very similar to like going and eating McDonald's instead of eating something like more healthy, right? It's like we all know that it's not really what's in our best interest, and it's not what's going to make us happiest long term. But in the moment, you kind of give into your weakness. And so, of course, there's exceptions, like I said, but I think, and there's also true polyglots, right? Like, Luca or, some of the other people in the community like actually do speak 10 languages fluently. But those people have like committed their whole life to learning language, living super hardcore balls to the wall. So, of course, I have respect for those people. But specifically for these people that just learn a little bit of a bunch of languages and never get really decent at the majority of the languages, like I think even they would, if they're going to be honest with themselves, would probably admit that what they're doing is not in their best interest, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, but would you say um like learning let's say more than 10 languages and like if you say so basically what I'm trying to say is like people try what I found people online doing is like they try to like compare this number because this number of how many languages you speak, it kind of becomes your like kind of brand. Oh, this guy he can speak this language, this guy can speak as like but proficiency in those languages it does not for let's
Yeah,
say
yeah.
let's be
So
honest
like
like
I think like yeah, I know. So yeah, to kind of address that aspect of it, like, um, I mean, yeah, it's a big problem because people are not able to judge proficiency in languages that they don't speak.
yeah.
So I call it the fluency illusion. So like
Mm,
someone could speak really, really shitty Japanese,
mm,
and if you're not like close to as good at Japanese as that person is, then they're just going to
mm,
sound totally fluent to you. Like
yeah.
it's funny because like when I speak Japanese, people like my mom who speaks zero Japanese will be like, "Wow, your accent is so good. You sound just like a native." It'd be like, "Well, how do you know? For all you know, I could be speaking with a Chinese accent when I speak
Mm,
Japanese, right? Or like a
mm,
Korean accent." What they're really saying is, "Wow, it doesn't sound Englishy when you speak Japanese." Right?
yes.
But
Yeah.
there's just because you don't sound Englishy doesn't mean that you're actually sounding like a Japanese person,
Mm,
right? And so people who are not really aware of this, like, yeah, when they can watch the videos of someone speaking 10 languages at a very, very low level and think, wow, this person is fluent in 10 languages, right?
mm,
So
mm,
yeah, like the average person that hasn't really delved very deeply into language learning, like that's probably what they're gonna think. So in a way, yeah, you could say these people, like most of these people in the community that are just like learning a little bit of a lot of languages, they're not putting themselves on YouTube to kind of brag about their like accomplishments, but there are people that do that, right? And so
yeah.
these people, in a way, are inadvertently kind of like deceiving a lot of these
Mm,
people that aren't really familiar with how language learning works by like kind
yeah.
of leading them on to think that they're like really fluent in all these languages when in reality they like speak them like really poorly. So like, yeah, I mean, I think if you want to think about the like total impressiveness of someone's achievement in language learning, it's going to be
Yeah.
some factorial equation that has to do with the number and the proficiency, right?
Yeah.
Like I think a lot of people like that's the thing is like most polyglots I find really respect me, even though I've only learned one language
Mm,
because they
mm,
understand how difficult it is to even in one language, especially a language like Japanese, to
Mm,
reach such a high level. And
mm,
so that's kind of the funny thing is like someone who actually is a polyglot would never criticize you for only knowing like one language or only knowing
mm,
X languages if you speak those
mm,
languages well,
mm,
right? Because
mm.
they understand that. It's really only the people that have no understanding of language learning. And so I guess,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's annoying, but my first reaction more than anything is just to try to educate them, right? Because that's what they really need is just like more education.
Yeah, it's like somebody can say, you speak only Japanese, but I'm fluent in German and Spanish. It's two, or let's say Italian. But they also don't know that there are like levels of languages and levels of difficulty. And like there are like five levels of languages, and Japanese takes like roughly 3.6 more times more time than let's say learning Italian or Spanish. So a lot of people they just try to compare those numbers and like say 10 languages, this, that. But there are, like if I want to cheat the system, I'll just like I'm as a Russian, I'll just learn Ukrainian, Polish, and like kind of I call them like different versions of the same language. Basically, like it's
Yeah.
very similar languages. And say the first polyglot online that I saw, like who claimed to be polyglot, he's like like the very first one, like in Russian. I was just like on YouTube for the first time, and I saw this guy. It's like he's speaking like Ukrainian, Polish, Russian, Belarusian, and I'm like, it's crazy, man. Like, and he claims to speak like 8 or 10 languages. Like back in the day, I saw it. Then now recently I just see people saying, but then no, but this guy, he's actually real polyglot, but he actually speaks like 10 plus languages and he's like really decent like most of them. But for me, it's like I cannot 100% say that what I'm saying about this person, let's say that I'm right, because I don't speak 10 languages, so I can't measure like his proficiency in all the 10 languages or like 13 or 15 whatever languages. But whenever I open, Russian is actually extremely complex language because of grammar, and Korean. Everybody, like like so-called polyglot that I say, like they say that they speak Korean. They actually Korean, like everybody fails at Korean. Like basically, Korean is like it's crazy. Even AI right now, like it's good in Japanese and Chinese, but it fails in Korean because Korean has
Mhm.
extremely complex language, complex grammar structure. Everybody thinks it's easy because of alphabet. I'm like, alphabet's actually difficult. It makes
Yeah,
it
I
more
mean, that might
difficult than
also be
kanji.
just a factor of how much input they're able to acquire and feed to the AI, not just
Yeah.
the language is,
Maybe,
complexity
yeah,
itself.
but basically, so basically, the thing is that the sorry, what was I talking about? Yeah, so yeah, I was trying to say that yeah, whenever I check those languages that I can speak, like four, like I can speak well, whenever I check those, I just see so many mistakes, or I can see like there are like let's say the video is extremely long, like 40 minutes, like you assume that the person would actually speak the language, and I open the video and it's just like all English or their native tongue
Mhm.
like for the most of the video. You know how I try to shoot my videos is like if I shoot, let's say, if I put out a 30-minute video, I just pretend not to speak the language, then I get the reaction. But after the reaction, the time is like 25 straight minutes of me speaking. So everybody can see that I speak the language
Mhm.
of 90% of the video. I speak the language 95. I can speak the like because it's not limited. Like I can speak unlimited. Like I have no limit on that because I've been living like for 8 years already here. But the thing is that, and I've been learning for so long. But the thing is, like, when I open those videos, like, they mark this segment as, let's say, speaking like Russian, but then they open, it's like, oh, he still speaks English. Oh, he still
Mhm.
speaks his own language. And I can't understand. And then it's like, and why would it matter? And then if you learn a language, then you make just a grammar mistake in every sentence, and then the people say, but I don't care about grammar, don't learn grammar. And then they use this thing, like this excuses, you don't have to be perfect in the language to speak and learn it and enjoy it. And I really like, oh man, like, yeah, you don't have to be perfect to speak it and practice it, but you like present yourself as a person being really good at speaking multiple languages, but while not being good at it, and everybody just gives you props for that. Yeah, of course, like the native, because they hear somebody speaking the language, for them it's like a respect. Even somebody speaks Russian, I'm like, oh, that's so good. Like I really like it. I'm not like, oh, he made the mistake. But if I actually take a critical time and I say, because here's the thing, like for me, the reason why I asked you this question, and the reason why I talk about it for such a long time, is because I just really believe that there is like I literally I thought that, oh, I'm just too slow in language learning because I tried to learn multiple languages as quickly as possible. I was too, and I realized, oh, that person just learned so many languages like in
Mhm.
in a very short period of time, and they seem to be speaking well. they don't seem to be a fake polyglot that I think about. And then I see, and then I open, and then I just realize that I can't check it fully because I can speak only four out of like whatever the huge number of languages. But what I see is that most of all is like pronunciation is okay, but their general proficiency is not on an intermediate level, sort of speaking, not on intermediate level, because people think
Mm.
intermediate is like really easy to get on, like it takes years. So basically, yeah, that's what I found for myself. It was kind of, first of all, it's like it was kind of really challenging to see at first, but then I saw it and I just realized that the depth is really not there in most of those cases. So
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the other thing too is that, just because like there's not a one-to-one correlation between how your language learning accomplishments and your ability to help other people learn languages. Right? It's just
mm,
like how in sports, the best coaches are not necessarily the people that were the best players. Right?
mm,
Sometimes actually the best players are not good coaches because they're so naturally talented that
mm,
they can't really experientially relate to people that are more average. Right?
mm,
Whereas like if somebody was average level talent and had to work their ass off and they got not the best, but they got really, really good, that
mm,
person's more likely to be a really good coach or a good teacher. Right. So
mm,
I think like you also have to separate like, oh, just because X person, learned X number of languages to like a really high level, that doesn't mean that their course is going to be the best one either.
mm,
Right. So yeah, that's like a whole other more complicated issue. And that's why also I think that like I don't think I'm the best at Japanese. There's a couple other people that I'd say like are foreigners and like are even better than me. But I
mm,
do think I have the best understanding of language acquisition than anyone that I've known because like
mm,
I have my experience and I've spent so long studying language acquisition, studying case studies of other people learning language acquisition, and like that was like my passion as much as learning Japanese was. So for me, I
mm,
kind of view my like you could say like value proposition is like I got really, really good at Japanese, like one of the best foreigners that I've ever
mm.
met. Maybe not like number one clearly by far, but like definitely like up there, like top 10. Plus, I have this like really deep understanding of language acquisition, and I've helped a lot of people get really good at Japanese with like my method, like coming up with like a analyzing the process and like formulating the method. So like that's why I kind of feel like I'm not really in that game of like it's almost kind of like a dick measuring contest, of like
Mm,
who's the best and like who's
mm,
accomplished the most and stuff like that.
mm,
Like, I mean, you kind of got to play that game a little bit
mm,
to like be on social media and like on
mm,
YouTube and things like that. And so of course I do, I have my videos that are like, oh, impressing Japanese people with
mm,
my like fluent Japanese. But
mm,
yeah, in a way, I think when you're in the game of doing multiple languages, you get sucked. You're kind of forced into that competition a little more. And
mm.
I kind of hear that when you're saying, so it almost just makes me glad that I never kind of like went there and the stuck like I kind of like carved out my own corner by just getting really, really good at one hard language and like was able to not get sucked into the like polyglot competition in that way.
Yeah, I realize myself. I'm just like following people. If I like, I almost don't check out content when it comes to language learning. But if I do it, I'm just like, oh, this guy just became, let's say, native without going to the country, and they have like their own thing. And I really subscribe for this content more than, not more, but I only watch, if I watch something I relate to language learning, I only watch this one, not like some, let's say, like speaking 20 languages type of thing. But yeah, it's like it's like the competition type of thing. But sometimes I just realize that people, yeah, the people who give respect or don't give respect, for, let's say, like you have comments, oh, you speak so many languages, how are you so talented, right? And somebody says, oh, you like, I actually speak the language and I know that you kind of speak well, like this type of comment. And these type of people are the most valuable ones. Like I really like seeing like very smart
Mm.
comments, and I just, and it just, yeah, it just kind of makes my day sometimes because I see that the person is really smart and they really know what's up. They really know. So for example, somebody says, oh, it's really easy to, buy something in Japanese, or like go to a convenience store, let's say in Korean, just understand what they tell you in convenience store. But they don't understand that there are so many levels to the language, so that there, like, every verb in Keigo, how you call it in Japanese, or like in the most respectful form, every single word gets substituted for a
Mm.
higher level alternative. They think that just buying things or just understanding what people say, or responding back to them, like in subtitles it shows up to like, oh, thank you, here is the card, something like this. But in actual language learning, it represents itself as a months and years of learning to just understand the pronunciation, the polite forms, the whole, like, the conjugations of verbs and everything. So it doesn't show in subtitles like this. So that's why they think that, oh, it's so easy because it's just one phrase. and then they see the polyglot, like the so-called also saying one phrase, and they say, "Oh, it's just the same," because like, oh, it's
Mm.
just the sentence, like, but they cannot like spot the pronunciation thing and stuff like this. So yeah,
Yeah, I
man,
mean,
I'm
I think in a way, like a lot of times the people that like my content are people that have been trying to learn languages or a language for a long time, haven't had the level of success that they hoped for.
mm,
And then they kind of, if you actually stick around and try to learn a language, you realize like, oh, getting really good at even one language is really hard, like way harder than
yeah,
I thought it would be initially. And if you actually do manage to get at least even decent at a language, and you look at these polyglot people and you're like, oh, they're not. I'm in learning this language, and like I'm not even good, but I'm already speaking better than this polyglot who like claims to be fluent in it. And then you kind of start to like realize like, oh, these people are not really what they're presenting themselves to be, and then
mm,
they'll watch my content, and then I'm like very like hard, I'm saying it as it is. Like it doesn't have
mm,
to be hardcore necessarily, but like, I'm being like, yeah, it takes a really, really, really long time just to get good at one language. And this is how
mm,
language learning actually works. And the stuff that I say like resonates with their experience. And so that's why I think like a lot of times someone who's brand new to language learning, they won't resonate with my stuff off the bat because they'll be
mm,
like, oh, you're making it sound so hard. These other guys are making it sound easy. I'm just gonna go to the guy that makes it sound easy. Right?
mm,
But once they've been in the game for a long time and they're like, okay, I know it's not easy. Just tell me what works. Because
mm,
I'm tired of stuff that doesn't work. That's when
mm.
then they'll respond more with my message, I feel like.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just like really different types of audiences. I think it's like the goals are different. Just the general, yeah. So, man, I really like. How long? How much time do you? I feel like I just asked you everything, and it was so amazing. I truly think it's the best language learning video I've ever done. Like on how to learn languages I've ever done.
Awesome.
It's just so good.
Yeah, it's been fun. Like I can tell it's always fun to talk to people that like did Korean instead of
Mm,
Japanese because there's so
mm,
many similarities.
yeah.
And then there's the differences that are always kind of fun to talk about as well, but it's always like it's almost like looking at myself in like a different timeline or something. A slightly
Yeah,
different
I
timeline.
mean, I started with Chinese, then I started learning like I became fluent in Chinese, and then I started learning Korean, but in China in Chinese.
Mm, cool.
So, and then I came to Korea. I started speaking Korean before I came here. But for me, like Keigo was completely like it's
Mm,
called Mar here. It's like it was like very bad. I couldn't speak. So and I started right from interviews. Like I wanted to get job here, like a corporate
mm.
job, and I started from interviews and I started working in Korean company. It was like insane. I learned so much during this process. And yeah, this is basically. And now I'm in Korea. I travel to Japan quite often, starting from recently, and I started learning Japanese because I like Japanese culture. I want to
Mm.
go there. I don't want to be like a dumb foreigner. But I just find myself like I just say this like Nihongo de daijoubu desu, and then it's like they start speaking really quick. I was like, oh god, dude. And it's like yeah, it's really interesting. And language learning. I just feel like Japanese might be just my last language for the next like 5 or 10 years, and I want to get extremely native in all languages I speak.
Mm.
And there's still
Nice.
like so many like levels to learn and everything. And yeah, it's like I mean if you like while learning Korean, it will be so much interesting for you. Like or let's say if you choose to learn Chinese after that, it will be the best. Yeah, so.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, you got to hit me up next time you come to Japan.
Yeah, when do you where like Tokyo? You're in Tokyo, right?
Yeah, I'm in Tokyo.
Okay, so yeah, I'll go. Yeah, I'll go there. This is probably like within a couple months. Um, yeah, so I like get back to YouTube and like try not to just think too much about the people who hate
Oh
because
yeah, I will. I will.
your product was still really good, right? Your
Yeah,
product,
all
your
the actual students liked it.
why would you put it? Oh, so it's because of yeah. I'll by the way, I'll cut it out. Don't worry, but it's
Yeah,
like just because of yeah, it's the agreement that you have. Yeah, I see. I would like to like yeah. Wow, do you
but
have time or you don't have time?
I got like maybe 15 more minutes.
15 more minutes. Because last question I forgot. I didn't ask or
Oh, go
just
ahead.
somehow didn't show up in my notes. What would you recommend? Yeah, what would you recommend? Because I already started speaking, let's say I already started speaking Japanese. I know how to speak a little bit, but if so, I might already have a lot of bad habits, and I think most people will be in my category, to be honest. It's like they're kind of started speaking already. What would you recommend for because I started speaking without any understanding of the pitch accent. So would you recommend AI or any kind of tool? Because I remember you're reading you're using some kind of tool where you would like look up every word and you would like look up a pitch accent in this word. So what would you recommend for people to master pitch accent?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on a couple things. Like I said, I think if you take a very listening heavy approach from the beginning, then you can pick up a lot of pitch accent without needing to do a lot of work. So I think at the very beginning, if you do like ear training, so you train yourself to hear the different pitch accent patterns that exist, and you
Mm,
become aware of the pitch accent that exists, and you kind of just keep it on your mind that it's a thing, and you take a living listening heavy approach, I think you should be able to just naturally pick up most of it without having to do that
mm,
much work. But if you take an approach that's based in reading, or you kind of just you go too far without really awakening your ears to pitch, then you're probably gonna there's a certain point you cross this point of no return where you're not gonna be able to pick it up naturally anymore, and you're gonna have to like really make it a conscious effort. And
mm,
honestly, if you're going to do that, it's a lot of work. And
mm,
so it's probably not going to be worth it for most people once they've reached that point. I think if you're still at the point where you have some hopes of picking it up naturally, everyone should do the ear training and like learn just the basics, because that little bit of work that you put in at the beginning will unlock huge gains that you'll just pick up naturally through the exposure.
mm,
So if you're at the beginning, it's going to be worth it for everybody. But once you cross that point of no return, and you're really going to have to do what I did, which is consciously completely relearn how to speak, basically by learning like every pitch accent rule and memorizing the pitch of every word, like it's a crazy amount of work. And so it's really only going to be worth it if you're like very serious about sounding like excellent in Japanese. And
mm.
if you want, and that was what I was like, right? I wanted to sound like a native speaker no matter what. I didn't care how much work it was. And so in that case, basically you have to go and learn every pitch accent rule, and you have to go and memorize the pitch of every word, and you have to consciously think about those rules when you speak, and make sure you're speaking with the right pitch, and just do that over and over until it basically becomes a habit.
So did you do it consciously or subconsciously? Like, I mean, like, did you like train yourself to think, to like you trained yourself and then it's like it's just the thinking becomes faster,
Yeah.
or was it like through exposure?
I think it mostly was a conscious process. I mean, it sounds
Ah,
very similar to what you said with like how you thought about the grammar conjugations.
mm,
And you get faster and faster, and it kind of becomes second nature, but you can
mm,
still feel that it's not 100% that natural. It's still something that your brain's you can kind of feel your brain doing it somewhere in the background, you know
mm,
like
mm,
it's kind of like that, but like overall your brain kind of makes bigger and bigger shortcuts. So like at the
mm,
beginning you're thinking about like word by word, conjugation by conjugation, whereas more and more there's just like big, like your brain chunks the language into bigger and bigger patterns, and it can process it more and more efficiently, to the point where like yeah, I can literally think of, I mean, and then it's also habitual, right? So like
mm.
you get into the habit of saying a word with the right pitch, and then it's just how you say it. You don't even have to think about it, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but even now, like there'll be times where like if I say a word that's kind of rare for the first time in like a long time, I'll have a moment where I'm like, wait, what's the pitch again? I won't be like totally sure. I'll have to like, look it up.
Mm,
And the other thing is like new words. I still feel like I don't pick up the pitch quite as much as Japanese people do. So like there's certain very specific things. Like for example, in Japanese people like to shorten things all the time, right?
mm,
I was just talking about this with a Japanese person the other day, where like, there's the brand North Face. In Japanese, it'd be Nosu Face.
mm,
And that right there is predictable because it's north plus face. And when you have two nouns next to each other, there's a pitch accent rule that determines the pitch. So that I didn't have to ask. But when they're speaking, casually, they'll shorten it just to nosu. Instead of saying nos face,
mm,
they'll just say nosu. And
mm,
this, it could be nosu or nosu.
mm,
And you don't know which one until you've heard a Japanese person say it. And
mm,
obviously, the shortened form of the brand North Face is not in any dictionary, obviously, right?
mm, mm,
Because it's way too niche. And so basically, you just have to hear a Japanese person say it to know what it is. And
mm.
a Japanese person, they just hear someone saying it once, they pick it up and then they just know it intuitively. Whereas for me, I have to consciously be like, okay, that was a tamadaka. Got it. And if I don't go
Mm,
through that conscious moment, then I won't know when I go to say it, I won't know which one it is. And I might
mm,
forget if I haven't heard it in a while. So ultimately, it feels like Japanese people, it's just a completely automated, unconscious system. Whereas for me, I still have to like kind of consciously keep track of it a little bit. It's probably similar to like, I don't know, like if it's a car, like driving manual versus automatic. It's like if you've been driving manual your whole life, like you don't actually think about it, right? But
mm,
you're still doing it. Whereas
mm,
like a native speaker is like an automatic car. It's like they're not even doing it at all. It's like
mm.
completely just automated in their brain. So yeah, that's been my experience. But like, yeah, you can like basically I'd say I don't know, I have like what, like 98%, 99% pitch accent accuracy. And I used to have like below 50% accuracy, probably. And so it's a
Mm.
huge difference. And Japanese people constantly comment on it. Like every time I speak
Wow.
Japanese, one of the most common comments I get, they specifically say is, "Whoa, your pitch accent is so natural. I've never
Yeah.
heard a pitch accent. I've never heard a foreigner that like actually gets pitch accent right." And
Yeah.
and it is super rare. Like 90% of foreigners, even if they're very fluent in Japanese, still make pitch accent mistakes like every other sentence or more. So it is
Yeah.
something that will make your Japanese really stand out as like beyond the next level beyond everyone else.
So and do like to get to that point, you have to like go through the manual process of going through the, let's say, text and just like looking up every word and like studying pitch accent for every word, right?
I mean, yeah, like I said, once if you're past that point of no return where
Mm,
you're probably not gonna be able to acquire it naturally anymore, then
mm,
yes. But like there
mm,
there are people that have acquired it like obviously
naturally.
natives acquire it naturally, right? They don't have to study. And there are people who have acquired it naturally without studying and
Mm,
have like very high accuracy. They're very, very rare. I only know of like a couple examples I can think of. But what those people had in common was that they took a almost exclusively listening heavy approach and they didn't do any
mm,
reading until like after they learned mainly you know how to speak through listening. And so if
mm,
you take a listening heavy, but I think if you combine a listening heavy approach with like training yourself to hear the patterns, like because there's it's just like with Mandarin, right?
or
There's four patterns at the
mm,
beginning you can't hear them,
yeah.
but you can do practice to train your ears to hear them. And if you just do that at the very
Mm,
beginning,
mm,
and then even if you don't take 100% listening approach, even if it's you have some reading in there, if you take like a listening heavy approach, even if it's not 100%, plus you do the ear training, I
mm,
think a lot of people will still be able to acquire the majority of it naturally. And then
mm,
maybe, and then afterwards, when they're already pretty fluent, they can just go and spot fix the things that their brain missed without having to
mm,
kind of rehaul the entire system.
mm.
So,
Yeah,
so
it's
it
like
really depends on your learning history.
it's really because when studying Chinese is like you hyper aware of tones. It's like, and I looked at your recent video from like 3 years ago when you're talking about pitch accents, and I think I can spot it really easily. I
Hmm.
just because of Chinese. It's like
Yeah, I
there
wouldn't
are
be
two words.
surprised.
Let me try, but you'll tell me whether it's correct. Ame, ame, ame. Is it correct? No,
They
probably
both
not.
they
It's
both
just
sound like the
the thing
same.
that I remember from the video.
They both sound like you said, Amet, which would
Oh,
be
really?
candy.
Oh, let me try. Ame, ame.
Yeah, there you go. That was
Yeah,
that was
okay. So
perfect.
I just switched a little bit. Yeah, so I saw that video just once and I didn't memorize the pitch accent patterns, but it's like I think I can memorize it easier and faster than just
Yeah,
because
I
of
would
the
imagine.
tonal experience. Yeah, because yeah, I can describe them with tones. Yeah, so
Yeah,
basically
I mean
that's
they're not that tricky. Well, I mean I'm biased because like by the time I started learning pitch accent,
hmm.
I had already spent like 10,000 hours listening to Japanese. So I picked
Ah,
them up like very, very quickly. I know it's a
mm,
lot harder because I've taught students pitch accent
mm,
before. So I know it's a lot harder. For me, it felt obvious. It's one of those things of once you can hear it, it feels super obvious, right? It's like, what? You can't hear that? It's like
mm,
clear as day. But
mm,
you can't hear it till you hear it.
mm. Yeah, 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 exactly. It's just it just takes training, I think. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah, 100%.
the thing that the project I will take from what you said, the project that I will take from myself is just I'll just go through a little bit of training with PCHX and like what it actually is, like all the different types of it, to be able to spot it, and then I'll just go through massive exposure and just try to. when listening, try to spot different pronunciations, be kind of aware of that. I think I'll
Yeah,
just take this
yeah. Like
approach.
another, yeah, big thing that I did that I probably should have mentioned is like after I started learning pitch accent, whenever I listened to Japanese, I would try to hear the pitch and kind of make
Mm,
note of it in my head of like, okay, pronounce that word that way, that word that way. And
mm,
I think that helped a lot too. So like, yeah, I think there's a the approach that you're saying, there's a good chance it will lead to you having good pitch. And if
mm,
not, like if it turns out you have to put in all the work, well, you're gonna have to put in all the work anyway, whether it's now or whether it's later. So you can always do it. I think that's a good approach. Is like hope that you can do it just through training your ears,
mm,
and if not, like maybe it'll work, and if not, then you can, if you choose to, you can try to rehaul it later. You know,
mm.
if you decided you think it'd be worth it.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, for people who have watched till this point, for you guys to master pitch accent, click the link down below. Go to the school community by Matt, and I think he's basically it's one of his strongest points for people who know they know. It's like it's the pitch accent. So yeah, click the link down below, and yeah. So basically, Matt, I really enjoyed talking to you. It's
Oh
like it
yeah.
feels like we talked for like 5 hours. And I already have like calls from my girlfriend's like, where are you? It's like I almost disappeared. Thank you so much, man. It was a lot of fun to talk about. It's like the deepest conversations, this deepest conversation I've ever had with any kind of language person in my life. And yeah, I think it will be like the very first interview on my channel as well. So
Awesome. Yeah, it was super fun. I always love
s-
talking about this stuff.